South African news consumers are increasingly concerned about misinformation and the spread of fake news. According to the 2024 Reuters digital news report, concern about misinformation increased by 6 percentage points in the past year and is now at 81%. Now, this is much higher than the global average concern about misinformation, which currently stands at 59%. I am joined now by Chris Roper, who's Code for Africa Deputy CEO. Chris, good to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, the Reuters digital news report highlights a significant concern, if you will, about misinformation in South Africa, with local trust in media at what, 57%? How has Code for Africa observed this evolving landscape, and what strategies are being pursued to combat misinformation?
Well, the second question is quite a complex one to answer. I'll give it a stab. But the first part of your question, which is about the kind of how has trust changed over the years? So we've been doing this report with Reuters for 4 years. Originally, it started with South Africa and Kenya, and then we added Nigeria, and then this year we've added Morocco. As Code for Africa, we fund the African sections of this report, which is why there are only 4 countries, because we're an NGO and it's very expensive. But the total number of countries they look at, I think, is 47. So 4 years ago, South Africa was, I think, number 1 or 2 on the list of countries that trusted the news the most, with, I think, over 60%. Now we've dipped down to 57%. We're still number 4 out of the 47 markets. So we still have a very trusted news environment. But as you mentioned earlier, we also, out of the 47 countries, I think we're number 1. That when we ask people the question, do you trust your ability to be able to discern what's real and what's fake online? 81% of South African digital news consumers said, no, we do not trust our ability. So in a sense, it's a paradox. We have a very trusted news environment, but at the same time, we have news consumers who don't trust what they see online. And actually, this is a really good thing for us, because it means that, you know, the buzzword nowadays is media literacy. One of the ways to fight misinformation is to teach people how to spot misinformation. I think we in South Africa are in a really good spot, because we have people who know that you can trust the media. But we also have the exact same consumers who say, but we still worry about what's real, what isn't real, and we're going to be careful about that. I think for us, that's the sweet spot. It's a sweet spot for any democracy, I think. But when you're asking about what can be done to combat misinformation, a lot of stuff is being done. You know, from kind of big projects working with the big platforms like Facebook and TikTok and so on, that uses AI and generative AI to monitor misinformation and flag it, get it taken down, to newsrooms that have been spinning up fact-checking desks across the continent and in South Africa. So a lot is being done to address the problem of misinformation.
So trust in South African media remains a critical issue, like you highlight, particularly amidst news of closures of major publications like the City Press and Report. How do these closures then impact media diversity, if you will, and the plurality, my apologies, of voices in the country? And what role can digital platforms then play in mitigating these losses?
That's a really good question, because, of course, the loss of newspapers and news organizations isn't just the loss of jobs and journalists. It's the erosion of a democratic pillar, of a watchdog of a democracy. So it's a very, very important moment, I think, was, you know, the people always say there's a difference between news media and actual journalism. So there's still a lot of journalism being done. Because the problem is that while there's a lot of journalism being done, people who can afford to do this deep dive investigative journalism, which takes months, which takes, you know, which is very expensive in terms of the technology you have to use to analyze data and that kind of thing. Those are the organizations that we really need to keep going. So news is still strong in South Africa. It's just we have to be very careful that we don't lose the kind of hard, dirty part of news. You know, so political news, we're great. Lots of kinds of news, we're great. But the really hard, deep investigative stuff, that's where I think we have to be a little careful about what we're losing.
I also want to probe your brain on news that's developed this week particularly. Now, Code for Africa is known for its advocacy of digital democracy and data journalism as well. In light of the shift to digital-only formats, such as Media24's planned restructuring, what are your thoughts on the future viability of digital journalism in the country, especially for sustaining diverse narratives and public engagement?
Yeah, so, as Code for Africa, we partner with about 350 newsrooms across the continent. We have journalists in 27 African countries. So we have a really good kind of macro view of the state of journalism. And media sustainability is a very difficult thing. Sustainability of journalism is a very difficult thing. A lot of journalism now has become philanthropy sponsored journalism. A lot of journalism still relies on kind of old advertising model, coupled with kind of whatever business opportunities they can find, and of course they're all cutting staff and resources. The kind of basic answer is that news organizations and journalists need to follow their audiences and go where the audiences are. Unfortunately, where those audiences are is in social media, and then the Reuters digital news report shows that trust in news on TikTok and Facebook and so on is very, very low. So it's not the ideal place to receive news in a sense. The growth of generative AI means that Google search referrals aren't going to happen so much anymore to news sites. Social media referrals have dropped dramatically, so news sites themselves are dying. The news site as a destination, I think the stat is something like only 20% of South Africans go directly to a news site now. Yeah. Most of them go via search or social media. So those are all the massive worrying challenges that news organizations have to face. I realize I haven't given you an answer. I've just told you how difficult the question is to answer. So that's cheating in a little bit of a way. But I think one of the things people are finding works is niching your news and niching your audience. The days of the massive behemoth news organizations reaching everybody, those are over. Now you have to carefully craft your news to match the audience that fits your news, and which means you have to really be clever about resources, and you have to be realistic about the kind of revenue you can turn on.
You're quite right in your assertions, because the report also notes a significant increase in news consumption via platforms like TikTok, with this shift away from traditional news sources. How can organizations like Code for Africa, for instance, then harness these trends to enhance civic engagement and media literacy among younger audiences as well, who are on these platforms?
Well, I don't worry about media literacy amongst younger audiences. I think younger audiences are media literate. I worry about media literacy amongst old journalists, because the media that you need to be literate in is TikTok and Facebook and dark social and so on. But talking about TikTok, one of the sort of startling stats for me was that TikTok's grown by 6 percentage points. So 28% of South Africans now find their news on TikTok. So it's grown 6% from last year. And that when the global Reuters report looked at TikTok and the news market, it found that the most growth, like the top 10 countries that have a growth in news consumption on TikTok, are all in the Southern Hemisphere. And all four of the African countries are in that top 10. So that's an interesting dynamic as well, where consumption in Africa, for the 4 countries we've looked at, consumption in Africa doesn't actually track to consumption in North America, for example. There's a real difference in the way we consume news.
Going back to using the Media24 example, the company's restructuring then highlights ongoing challenges in the media industry, including financial constraints and declining readership. From your perspective, Chris, what structural changes are necessary for media organizations to adapt and indeed thrive in today's digital era?
Well, first of all, I think stopping print publications was a crucial one. A sad one, but crucial. It's a digital only. In fact, in all the conferences I've been to lately, people are talking about the old school, old time digital media. Traditional media. And what they mean is not newspapers. They mean news websites like the New York Times and News24. That is the old media now. So I think it's going to be really, really key that news organizations, the kind of mainstream big news organizations, that they actually break themselves faster. You have to really mercilessly get rid of the stuff that isn't working to try and maximize the stuff that is working. And certainly with News24, over the last 4 years that we've been doing this, they've always been number one most trusted brand. Once or twice sharing with BBC, but always most trusted. Not that it's not a ranking. It's we just measure trust in certain brands and not all brands. So, but still, they are a very trusted brand.
Yeah. And going back to the theme of misinformation, in your view, how can media organizations then rebuild this trust amid concerns over biased reporting and even misinformation, especially given the competitive pressures in the digital age?
I think key is going to be a two-way communication with your audience. So one of the massive mistakes that media made sort of 25, 30 years ago was not understanding the importance of keeping your audience to yourself.
Yeah.
They gave it away to social media and to digital. By that I mean gave away the data about that audience. So I think one of the key things that we're going to have to do is to try and rekindle that relationship with our audience that does trust us, which is still a large audience. And I also think that the changes that generative AI are going to make to the news industry is like, it's seismic, it's massive. In 10 years' time, nothing is going to look like where it looks now. And I think news organizations have to understand that. And in the Reuters digital news report, one of the interesting things was that the country, out of the 47 countries they looked at, the country that was most comfortable with AI-produced news was South Africa. So we clearly are ready for it. I think that's going to be key. You've got to harness all the powers of technology and also make sure you keep that relationship with your audience going.
And lastly, Chris, as we look ahead, what are some of the key opportunities and even challenges that you foresee for the media landscape in the country, particularly in terms of fostering a healthy information ecosystem, but also maintaining public trust?
Well, I think the answers are going to be probably the same answers that people have given every year for the past 10 years. Transparency, And in a country like South Africa, which is a country that is so dramatically unequal, diversity, more and more diversity. We have done a lot to try and achieve a diverse media, but we're nowhere near that yet. So we need a much greater diversity of not voices that we've kind of cracked, but a diversity of ownership and of like the driving power behind media. That has to be much more diverse. And and again, I think the opportunities that AI brings to the global south are immense. So a lot of what news organizations need to do now is to staff up with AI technicians and prompt engineers and try and own kind of an African large language model or multiplicity of African large language models, so that AI works for us. We're not the extractive minerals for AI from the global north. We actually have our own AI systems and regulations and opportunities in place.
Chris, let me thank you for your time. That was Chris Roper, Code for Africa Deputy CEO.